Hello, very beautiful community. Don't get freaked out if in the middle of this I get substituted for a slightly different Vlad with a slightly different white shirt. This is going to be a long form question and answer session. It's going to take us a couple of hours, maybe an hour and a half. Our first question is from beautiful friend of the channel, aragusea. And my answer is going to be out of date, but it's still, I think, interesting to go there just to capture a bit more what was going on with Biden. So Adam says, Vlad, hi, Adam, lovely to see you. Have you considered the possibility that Biden may sincerely believe he is the only person with a chance in hell of A, securing the Democratic nomination, and B, beating Trump? This is a question from a couple of days before Biden stepped down. I'd hope he is wrong about that, but I'm not sure he is, given the realistic alternatives available. Edit, you've obviously considered it, but I'm asking why you have apparently dismissed it. So my feeling is that views that Joe may have held or half held are derivative. And what's really gone on there is that he began to be dragged in by power. Not just power in the sense of I want power, but power in the sense of I am really good and indeed ethically good at dealing with power, so let me continue. That was his feeling. So it's a bit like you wanting to make a very, very beautiful pasta dish for somebody who is just completely intolerant of pasta because they just don't get it. And all you can feel is, oh my word, I'm going to breathe my way through the stages of the dish. I'll really sort of massage the creation of it very nicely. It'll be beautifully well done. It'll be fantastically emulsified. And you're there, and all you're thinking about is just going all the way through it. But the person doesn't want it. You're doing the right thing in the wrong context, the right thing at the wrong time. So what happened to Joe was that he was being, and this is an emotional intelligence rate, which is why views are secondary, because that's the drive there. Joe was caught up in the idea of not just wanting power, but feeling, my word, I have been practically an efficacious president, and more so than Barack Obama. Now, is that true of Joe Biden's term? I would say that it is. So he's actually not delusional there. He's saying, hey, I can barely speak and I can't communicate in public, but I have been a disproportionately efficacious president because I'm good at politics. And I feel that my record really means that I've got to have that second term. I'm good at this. I'm going to do more of it, you know? And he couldn't see that two things were going on. That A, he was on course to lose, and B, that his second term would be a democratic disaster for the United States because of his cognitive decline. Might not be as disastrous as a Trump second term, but still it'd be disastrous because you would have a president at a critical, pivotal historical moment who is deteriorating, and even short of deteriorating, is already in a place where he would reasonably look to a lot of people like he's a puppet because he cannot function. And that's a false impression, because this is really our problem today. We can't keep two things in mind at the same time. Joe, even up until the last few months, was very practically efficacious as a president, but he looked like he was completely gone. So this is about understanding cognitive decline. You can forget where you are. You can forget who is Putin and who is Zelensky, but still be able to be a good practical politician, good at pushing through policies, good at bringing people together, good at getting things done, but unable to string a sentence together. That's compatible. But you can't demonstrate that to citizens. And it's utterly toxic to persist in that state. So he was oblivious to the democratic toxicity of his cognitive decline, and oblivious to the fact that he was set to lose. And when I say set to lose, not that he was guaranteed to lose, because anything can happen, but as far as realistic chances go, Biden was going to lose. So it was close to 595 to Trump, with Biden staying not 50-50. What Biden thought about these chances is really secondary, because you could feel him getting caught up. And when I comment on this as an infinitesimal public intellectual, it's my responsibility to call out what we're looking at. Is it Joe Biden dealing with a very difficult judgment, or is it something sick and toxic going on? And it's my role to say, if that's what I see, that it's something sick and toxic, that this was something sort of early onset Putinite going on. This was a toxic, sick absorption in power. It wasn't Joe just trying to decide. And this was Jill, and I'm sorry, it is appropriate to speak like this because it's politics with huge consequences. Jill was not at her best in that moment as a partner, because Joe was being hijacked by this allure of power, or at least the allure of the correct perception of one's efficacy in power. That's very powerful. I mean, there are very few things in the world like it. You could argue that the love for a child is a more powerful pull than power. You could argue that certain kinds of extraordinary romantic love can be. That, you know, you feel that without it, everything falls apart. So that's how powerful it is. And if you stay too long in an undemocratic system like Putin has done, then it becomes more compelling than anything else. And you can literally end up thinking that, you know, up is down and down is up, sincerely, because that serves you. And that's a function of your being caught up in this thirst for power. So Biden was dangerously drifting. And that's why I call it out as something sick and toxic, something that borderline, it's not my politics, I'm much more open than this, but borderline could reasonably lead somebody to say, if I meet Biden in person, I'm never going to shake his hand for wanting a second term, given his state. Now, I'd shake his hand, but this was that. It wasn't Biden making a difficult and uncertain decision. So anybody looking at this from a good distance, in my judgment, needed to start with the idea that Biden goes. And then you build from that. That's what happened. I do think still that Kamala is very likely to lose to Trump. But there's no question that her chances are incomparably better of beating Trump than Biden's. So I think that's how I feel about it. So it's an emotional intelligence read of Biden being caught up in power. And therefore his own judgments about this were secondary. But obviously he wished to think that he is the guy to do it. And the only thing he was right about in all of this is that indeed he was a better practical politician than Kamala Harris or than Obama, or for that matter, than any Democratic candidate. But that's not the point, right? Because democracy is on the line and electability is on the line. And the danger of a very toxic second term where you're in cognitive decline, that could just wreck trust even further in a country that is so bitterly polarized by distrust of institutions. Thank you so much for taking your time with this, Adam, and you are dismissed from this Q&A because you're a busy man who needs to make happiness for the world with YouTube. Lots of love. Our next question is from Chad, and it's about how organizations or institutions take or don't take sides in politics. So I think it's an opportunity for exploration for us, quite apart from the particular issue this happens to be about. So I hope we enrich ourselves a bit through it. Let's have a go. Chad says, I and many other Berlin musicians are scheduled to perform at a music festival at a venue operated by folks with a diverse view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. None of the views are hard Zionist or racist, but some veer away from the boycott, divestment, sanctions, or from the river to the sea pro-Palestinian position, which is the assumed default in my scene. Wokist musicians are attempting to organize a boycott of this venue, not for any actions or even any particular public stance this venue has done, but for allowing pluralism. In the past, it welcomed some BDS groups, but it did not require a BDS stance and welcomed anti-BDS folks too. And it drew a line for the BDSs at allowing artists to use their stage to say some rhetoric that it saw as anti-Semitic. The boycotters see these latter actions as liberal, used pejoratively, and Zionist, used pejoratively. The boycotters are putting social pressure, but we think boycotting an entire venue because it refuses to blacklist artists for slightly more pro-Israel views would be counterproductive. I treasure your recommendations for any philosophical background reading. My hope is that we can stay above the trenches and use our platform for short, simple statements and links to helpful thinkers. We'd like to take this opportunity to steer the Berlin left toward tolerant moderation. As an aside, I keep checking myself and hoping that I'd behave consistently if this were about a different issue, if this were about Russia-Ukraine, around which I feel much greater moral clarity than I do about Israel-Palestine. Would I be behaving similarly if Russia-Ukraine were the issue? I hope so. Can't wait for your answer. So, yeah, I think this is important, Chad, because it's really potentially about any issue, and it's about potentially any organization, any body, any venue taking side in politics. So let's start with some general remarks and then get a little bit more specific. So what is wokeism in the bad sense, hyper-identity politics in the bad sense? It's when the following stages occur. When people take a political position, right, but then they move that political position to the moral realm and it becomes a moral stance. When they then take that moral stance and make it about identity, right? So we've already got 3 steps here. The political has become the moral and the moral has become the identity. Then there is a 4th stance where you demand institutions and organizations to take your side in the particular identity you're expressing. And then there is a 5th step, which is that you expect organizations not just to take your side in promoting this particular identity, but to actually think of themselves as being on a mission to cultivate that identity in others. So that's to say, make politics morals, make morals identity, make identity into institutional demand, and make that institutional demand, this is the sort of 5th post here, about it inculcating that identity in others, which is, of course, not just expressive politics, but toxic expressive politics, because it tries to take institutions into the realm of taking sides in unresolved conflicts in society. It's you faking your way as a citizen because you are trying to pretend you've won arguments you haven't won. And of course, my advice is to be very careful about that 1, 2, 3 step, because making politics about a moral stance and making a moral stance about identity means that you essentially cannot deal with conflict constructively, cannot deal with disagreement constructively. So that's what the fear of hyper-identity politics dragging centrist politics in a bad direction is all about. The pattern I've described is not left. There's nothing left in it. It's more about taking good old liberal values like inclusion and toleration and recognition and just putting them on steroids. So that 5-stage deformation, which is a wokist deformation, is not left. It's actually centrist liberalism gone crazy. So let's sort of concretize this a bit. It depends on the institution and on the organization, how it handles taking sides politically. If it's a very big institution that is supposed to cater to the entire population, that's a totally different proposition to a funky fun club, right? So let's take an example. Imagine that the most major classical music venue in the country decides to take sides in a political issue. I think that's very bad. What they should do is allow particular musicians who play to express their own views within limit, but not themselves as an organization take sides, right? So you do not want, you know, the Berlin Philharmonic Hall or the Musikverein in Vienna or the Royal Festival Hall in England being plastered with explicit political positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't want to hear that either way. But you can let musicians express a stance. But when musicians express a stance, it should be quite general, focused on being humane, and focus on bringing consciousness to suffering rather than being very explicitly political. So I'm happy with a conductor before a performance to play the Ukrainian national anthem. I am not happy for them to do a 30-second speech about Ukraine being in NATO, even if I support Ukraine being in NATO. You understand? That's a difference. The same with Gaza. I'm happy to see a musician saying, my heart is with tens of thousands who've lost their lives. You could say needlessly. But I don't want a speech about what a disgrace Joe Biden is at not having done more to stop this. So you see, when musicians take a stance, in this classical music example, I want it to have a kind of broad dignity to it that would be palatable to a wide range of people, because you're just going to destroy Beethoven if you're going to sort of preempt Beethoven with a polarizing political position. So that's one thing. When it's expressed, it needs to have an inclusiveness toward people with different views. And then at an even earlier stage, the organization itself shouldn't take any sides. An extreme form of this is the university, which really shouldn't take sides at all in these issues. I would even go as far as saying shouldn't take sides on Ukraine. So if you are Oxford University, what you want is for your academics to take sides on Ukraine, right? You want an academic to put a Ukrainian flag on their door if that's what they're passionate about. You want an academic to say, doing this speech on the weekend about how we got to help Ukraine. That's fantastic. But that is the institution staying out of politics to facilitate its members, the academics and the students, into being political. Now, of course, what's different about the classical music example I've given is that it's a major venue that is meant to cater for the whole country. If you've got a small comedy club or a small jazz club or a small theater or cultural value, of course you don't have to do that because it's not catering for the whole country. So you could absolutely have a communist theater. You could have a theater that is all about the futile project, as I would call it, of detaching communism from its implementations in practice. That would be totally legit. I don't see a problem with that. Now, if I were running something like the sort of venue that you seem to be describing, I would personally want the venue to stay out of taking a side. And I would want the venue perhaps to only draw a very, very, very firm line under allowing perspectives that can be described as incitations to, you know, engage in promoting physical harm to people quite directly, so really calls for violence. That has to be banned. Short of that, I'd be tempted to be open, and if what you're describing is really a conflict between people who condemn Israel's response to the horrific terrorist attack of October 7th, if the difference is between people who condemn that and people who half condemn it, of course I'd welcome both with open arms, and I would disallow either to try to obstruct the other. So I would need to say a very, very firm no here. So what I wouldn't do is try to legislate my own position. I'll give you the example of my own position here, if you want, into what's allowed to be said there. In other words, my own position is that there are no liberatory credentials to the barbarism of October 7th, and that there is no justification for Israel's response being anything like what it is. In other words, it's not close. It's like 50-fold out of the realm of the acceptable. So it's an outright condemnation of October 7th, but then also condemnation of Israel's response. Now, I do not want to legislate that. I want to allow people who want to push me back a bit on that position from whatever side. So would I allow people who want to ascribe to what I call 100% barbarism a tag of being 90% barbarism but 10% liberatory? Yeah, I'd want to hear these people out. I'd let them be heard out. Would I want to give voice to people who completely reject what I'm saying about the disproportionality of Israel's response and say, what are we meant to do? What is Israel meant to do? Right? Common position. Yeah. So in both directions, you should be able to air positions that veer into the psychopathic. Absolutely. Otherwise, you just can't bring anyone together or function properly. But if you want to just snuff out positions that smell of the psychopathic, you're just going to have a little ideological hothouse that you'll experience as a bubble, which I don't think will be constructive, and probably is possible but hard to square with a really nice mixed statistic, exploratory artistic mission. So that's how I'd begin doing it. In terms of reading, I'll throw it in the notes. You could read Alistair McIntyre's amazing paper, although it's demanding, on compartmentalization. How people have one ethical stance in one realm of their life but another in another, even though they're inconsistent. Michael Ignatiev's essay on thinking for yourself, and in a broader context, maybe Avishai Margalit's book on ethical and unethical compromise. So I hope that helps a tiny bit. Our next question is really about pro-Russian intellectual grift, and it's a question from Alexander Konopko. Hello, Alex, or Sasha, whatever you go by. Let's give this a whirl. I want to share a thought about Russian propaganda. It seems to me that a new type of rising star is about who philosophically justifies Russian aggression. A new, young, and very subtle philosopher, Pavel Shelin, is lining up alongside Dugin. Unlike the obscure Dugin, Pavel is a bright intellectual, a philosopher who was educated in the West. He masterfully shows Russia's rightness, quote-unquote, through orthodox mysticism and historical conditioning. He shows it in such a way that it is easy for a thinking person to agree with him. Perhaps you'd be interested in familiarizing yourself with his videos. For a couple of years, no one knew him, but he's now got 70,000 on his YouTube channel and is growing rapidly. In your video about propaganda, you say that Russia wants to pretend that it offers a civilization alternative. This is the danger of Shelin. He really builds a clear, consistent discourse. This is propaganda aimed at intellectuals. So, Shelin is a Ukrainian guy who presumably is in America. I don't watch him. I won't watch him extra, but I have seen snippets. So let's say a few particular remarks and maybe something wider about dealing with that sort of stuff. Well, let's start with something wider. Historically, political daftness or ghastliness has been a possible course of action for great thinkers or nearly great thinkers. I mean, the most extreme case in the history of the West is probably Martin Heidegger. My own problem with Heidegger is that while he is a low-level, there are three levels of philosophical genius in my view. Martin Heidegger is a low-level philosophical genius, but he is also a philosophical fraud. And that's because in his work, he substitutes the real difficulty and depth that needs to be got at via more cultural and historical understanding, and he substitutes this necessary cultural and historical understanding by abstract and obscure and pompous ontological reflection on capital B, being. And that is an elementary evasion. But even though he is an intellectual charlatan, he is a low-level philosophical genius and absolutely well worth reading and studying. And then over and above that, of course, you get his ghastly personal behavior, into which I won't get into, but it's terrible. I was once in a small room with the wonderful philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, and Alistair told us that if it were up to him and his view, he would have done everything in his power to ensure that Heidegger after the war was dealt with via capital punishment. For which Alistair, because this got out, and Alistair then got into trouble for saying this. And but these are the difficult dilemmas we're dealing with. It's not difficult with the boy, Pasha Shelin. It's not that he is a thinker of depth who then favors evil. He just favors evil and can think fairly brightly. No, he doesn't offer subtlety or systematicity. I mean, he's bright and he can think with analytical clarity, but he doesn't offer subtlety or sort of compelling insight or whatever it is that you're describing. I mean, this is a boy who says something like that at the beginning of the war, he was very much against the Russian invasion, but over time, he came to see that Ukraine's potential for the actualization of its territory as the locus of the glory of old Rus is not what he thought it was. So he thought that this territory didn't have this kind of somewhat mystical historical potential after he reflected properly on its history. Right? So this is cheap intellectual masturbation. This is not clarity. This is just bullshit. This is substitution of real issues for shallow BS without the intellectual sophistication of an important and arguably great thinker like Heidegger. So that's not refined. And I'd argue that he is, from the snippets I've heard, much less sophisticated than Dugin. However, is a young boy who is behaving like a muppet. Clearly, the boy can grow out of being a muppet. So that's what I would say. No, I don't see any intellectual danger. No serious intellectual would even a quarter of the step of the way be compelled by this. It's non-intellectuals who are going to be compelled by this, thinking this is serious stuff when it isn't, right? So this is, even if he's sincere about his turn, right? And we don't need to debate that, whether he's sincere or half sincere or not sincere. It's still the substitution of real stuff and selling people a fraud, right? Even if he's selling people, empty sacks, and he honestly thinks they contain potatoes, there's people buying sacks thinking it's potato in there, but it's empty. So that's really what's going on. So I just reduce this to zero. I don't think there's any complexity or tension or really even danger there. Our next question is from Dirt Monster about compulsory voting. Vlad, what's your view on compulsory voting? We've got it in Aussie land. I'd suggest most people here have a positive view of it. Compelling people to turn up means most people form a view, with 98% genuine turnout that drives things to the center. We also have preferential voting, so every vote counts. On top of that, pre-poll early voting grows every year. Lots of people don't wait for election day. They already know how they will vote. Voting in Australia is seen as an obligation, not a right. What do you think? So, any reform of this kind, whether it be introducing compulsory voting or changing the electoral system, or introducing supplementary political institutions like citizens' assemblies, or transforming the current political institutions, let's say changing the form or the mode of getting into one of the houses of parliament in a democracy, all of that is context dependent. There is no such thing as a moral position on this, and there is no such thing as a theoretical position of this. Humans are like this, politics is like that, so therefore compulsory voting. No. So that's an important aside. So there is nothing you can sort of conclude with a full stop before you look at a particular country in a particular political context. In the crisis of democracy that we are in, my view is that tendentiously compulsory voting is good. So for instance, I would favor it in Britain. And I would start off favoring it tendentiously in Western democracies, with the openness that in some countries there could be compelling contingent arguments against it. But roughly speaking, I think we need to be bolder rather than more conservative and more defensive in how we think about the transformation about our political system, to bring it about that more people feel that they can actually touch politics, and that when they touch it, they feel that it's something tangible and real. They might not like everything about it, but they feel that it's there, and they also feel that they have some minimal capacity to inflect it, some minimal capacity to make a difference. That is often absent. So tendentiously, the practical political answer is yes, and you've got to be careful about implementation. You don't want to penalize structurally disadvantaged people for not participating in elections. You've got to be careful about how you do it, but the answer is basically tendentiously across the West, you've got to start with the assumption that yes, that would be better. Our next question is from Lynette, and Lynette, you're asking, have you read Project 2025? What they have planned for Trump's presidency is frightening. Well, we're out of the bay, but we're not sinking. So crisis, but no collapse. Concern, but not panic. It's frightening, but it's conventional. It's part of a threat that, to a lesser or greater extent, virtually all democracies are going to face over the coming years. How would I describe it? How would I describe Project 2025 in my minimal capacity as a public intellectual who is also a political philosopher. I would say that it's an enterprise that is about using democracy to undermine democracy by rigging, tilting the rules of the game against the opponents of those who are in power, thereby shifting liberal democracy toward illiberal democracy. That's to say, shifting a liberal democracy where there's a plurality of functional institutions that act as checks and balances further toward a situation where there is just majority rule, but with fewer functional institutional checks and balances. That kind of enterprise is a threat that is going to just be here. And if anything is going to change between now and, let's say, the 2030s, is that projects like 2025 will get more serious and more efficacious. What kind of patterns might you perceive when you're talking about this sort of thing? Well, I think one pattern that you want to perceive is this collapse of conservatism. Conservatives becoming increasingly anti-constitutional while remaining in constitutional clothes, right? We've spoken earlier about the problem in centrist politics, of hyper-identity politics. There are many other problems in centrist politics. For instance, the problem that centrist politics can't realize the different ways it's actually causing destructive populism. But the big problem on the right is that you've got folks who are no longer conservatives pretending they still are. They're pretending they're conservatives who still take seriously the democratic game, but in fact they want to break it. So these are ex-conservatives now in conservative clothes, fooling citizens. That's one very big pattern, the collapse on the right of democratic credentials and the fraudulence of wanting to persist with the impression that you haven't given up on such credentials when you have, which is a grave moral disgrace for everybody participating in it. And then the other pattern is to do with the capacity of those who have a knack for using democracy to undermine democracy, to form an elite around them. And so what Project 2025 and Trump's links to Project 2025 signal is that Trump is going to be more serious if he gains power the second time round, which is uncertain but likely. Likely to very likely, I would even say, as we see here. Is that he will take this business of not getting co-opted and forming an elite around him that will allow him to implement, right, a vision that does partly undermine institutions more effectively. So the formation of an elite around Trump is one pattern we're observing in this micro sense of a particular political leader in this circle. And then the bigger pattern is this collapse of constitutional conservatism and its fraudulent presentation of itself as though it was still constitutional when it isn't. Now, what we have to understand is that there's enormous institutional resilience in the United States, enormous institutional pluralism, but that big pack of proposals that Project 2025 offers is an attempt, a systematic attempt to degrade the efficacy of institutions, which are the basic checks and balances, fair, of a liberal democracy, and thereby tilt the United States a few steps toward being a kind of illiberal majoritarian democracy. Our next question is from Anne. Hello, Anne. And Anne's asking a question about polarization in our democracies. Unsafe, powerless, betrayed, with the sense of opacity. So these are the 4 things that you all know I list as feelings citizens in democracies in decline have, opacity being the worst, where you look at your political institutions that don't make sense. And Anne says, yes, these are the core problems, but I don't think there is an easy solution to any of them, because I think there is something you miss out in this analysis, which, I'll just make a quick phone call before we go on. Hello? Yes, is this the hotline for cult leaders? Yes, so mine is called Beautiful Community. Have you got it? Oh, there's several. So mine is Beautiful Community with a slight Australian accent. So like Beautiful Community, like water community. You've got it. Okay, good. So I have a problem. I've got a cult member here who is questioning my omnipotence and omniscience. Is it possible to send her to like a cult jail? You don't do that anymore. I need to go and have therapy for control freakery. I think your new democratic approach is unsuitable. I don't think that Anne needs this. I think she needs a different civilizational option. Listen, I'll think about the therapy sessions, and I'll call you back. All right. And that was just completely unrelated to your question. Sorry, I had to take the call in the middle. I hope you can forgive that. We'll get back straight to your question. I think there's something you miss out in this analysis, which is that there's a natural human instinct to assume that most good people think the same way that they and their friends do. Well, let's circle that and come back to it. We need the majority of people to be of a mindset where we accept people who are different from us, think differently from us, and value their humanity. Okay, let's circle that. The fact that we're losing this trait is, I think, the most critical element that is destroying our democracies. Okay, let's circle that as well. So if you feel unsafe because your community is being undermined by a large influx of immigrants, you might be angry or betrayed, then you retreat to your own community and feel bitter toward the others. Or if you're a trans woman facing hatred, you're bound to feel that the majority hates you and the politicians aren't on your side, and so you retreat into your own community for safety. These are just 2 examples. But basically, you'll retreat into your own community of people who agree and be bitter towards everybody else who doesn't for safety. We need to make a concerted effort to find ways to connect with each other again and stop hating each other. It's this hatred and the connected division of communities that's at the root of why democracies are crumbling. Who do you hate in your democratic society? Could you find a way to hate them less? Could you find a way to engage? We can all start to try to do this. We might be able to address the 4 problems of unsafety, powerlessness, betrayal, and suffering. And political opacity, sorry. So let's give this a tiny whirl. See if we can say something useful. I mean, let's make a sort of sideways remark about public intellectual communication. So what I do when I talk to you, for example, about the 4 causes of democratic decline or the 4 emotions people feel, what I'm really doing is taking you, just gently directing you to look in a particular direction, and then I'm just letting you go, which means you may keep looking in that direction, You may keep looking and walking deeper and deeper into that direction. You may immediately change back to another direction and look elsewhere. So what I'm doing is I am thinking about what it is that is important to see for you that you may not be looking at enough, and I'm gently pointing you in that direction. That's all. So a lot of these formulations are, if you like, tips of the top of a mountain and directional clues, right? They are not recipes for dishes where I present the dish and I tell you everything that's in it and I tell you why everything that's in it. The recipe is invisible. And the reasons for the dishes being presented isn't because they are dishes that I like. It's typically that they are dishes that are tendentiously less present in your diet. So as a kind of compensation, I put them in. So that's a little bit of a sideways, if you like, curious look into how public intellectual psychology works. Now let's jump straight into some of the things you're saying here. So you're talking about a natural human instinct to think that most people assume that other people, if they're good, are going to think similarly. Now, one of the things that is a part of my professional life that doesn't appear much on this channel is the idea of value pluralism. And that's really an idea that has two elements. The first is that values are incompatible, and the second is that values are incommensurable. The first bit is really the thought that the enterprise throughout the history of the Western world to harmonize values is illusory. It's a conceptual incoherence. So, when Jean-Jacques Rousseau says, if you take equality and liberty and understand these two values properly, you'll see that really there cannot be a conflict between them, right? And I say there is no such possibility to reconcile two values like that at a general level and render them compatible. There's always the possibility to make the right trade-off in practice, but that's separate. Moreover, I also importantly deny, as part of this value pluralism, the thought that values, while incompatible, might be commensurable, right? So a Kantian moral theorist might come along and say, well, Rousseau is wrong. But even though Rousseau is wrong and values are incompatible, we can prescribe and ascertain principles of right and justice that will allow us to, at a general level, arbitrate conflict between values, thereby rendering incompatible values commensurable. That went over most people's heads, but that is a step in the direction of a deep sense of pluralism of values in human life. Right? What's important about our world is that it is sociologically dominated by consciousness of pluralism. But whether you're talking about humans who are more or less conscious of pluralism because of their historical location, the conceptual truth of pluralism as a truth about human values remains. So I've just again taken you around the back a little bit. And made a point that I typically try to keep off the page, a point about our ethical and political lives. Now, which speaks to the pluralism that you're gesturing toward, You're talking about a natural instinct to assume that other people who are good are going to think what you think. And here we've got to not say that that's wrong, but that that's something you've got to be cautious about. Because you can never explain what's happening in a democracy by appealing to universal human instincts. Because if something is a consequence of such instincts, it's going to be present in all societies. But if it isn't, then but if it isn't a universal instinct, then what will be the case typically is that either it's something that is a disposition you find in particular cultures, or more reasonably, it's a universal instinct that expresses itself in very different ways in different cultural circumstances. That's better, because that way you'll be able to begin explaining why certain things are happening in certain cultures but not in others. If you just put on the table a kind of universal instinct, you will never be able to explain questions like, why is this happening here but not there? Why is this happening in one historical moment but not in another? Right? That's why something like evolutionary psychology has virtually nothing to say about an issue like democratic decline, because it can only tell us things that have a universal form that then get expressed in very different ways in different cultural circumstances. And that expression of universal human psychology, it's very different in different cultural circumstances, is what may help us explain why it's so here but not so there. We need the majority of people to be of a mindset but where we accept difference, accept people who think differently from us, and value their humanity. So you can't value their humanity realistically. That's not a realistic political proposal. What you can propose is solidarity, right? That you value people in virtue of their belonging to the society you share with them. And there are different things you can appeal to here. One thing you can appeal that's quite easy to appeal to is solidarity. That means you share a bond with all citizens in your society. Another thing you could appeal to is the public good. That's harder to appeal to because it's not just about counting the citizens up and saying we're all in this together. Appealing to the public good means developing a view of common goods that everybody in society shares. And there are some good questions as to how far, under contemporary political conditions, under the contemporary form that the state takes as well, it is possible to go very far talking about goods shared in common by all citizens. I don't want to legislate on that, but I'm saying that's a harder question than solidarity. What else could you put in there? You could put equality before the law there. That's very important. In fact, I think that together with solidarity is a really powerful way to advance the rights of disadvantaged groups. I mean, you mentioned trans people. That's the best way to advance their rights. The current way their rights are being advanced is, in my view, going to backfire. It's already backfiring. Because they're not being advanced by appeal to what all citizens share in common. And that means that your arguments are more conflictive, and even your wins in political conflicts are less sustainable and more vulnerable to reversal. Something else you can appeal to is a shared sense of fairness, by which I don't mean that everybody in society has the same sense of fairness. What I rather mean is that people have different senses of fairness, but they agree that they should relate to each other in terms of the value of fairness, even though they have different conceptions of it, as opposed to doing what is to a good extent happening in Russia, which is citizens not relating to each other at all in terms of fairness or unfairness. They just relate to each other as a population on a territory that may enter into conflict, but do not share in a sense of fairness about which they might conflict and dispute. Now, the risk with your proposal that we need to make a concerted effort to connect with each other again and stop hating each other is that it risks saying that we need to get more rational and reasonable, or that we need to get more empathetic. And lack of reasonableness and lack of empathy cannot be a significant part of the causal explanation of what's happened. Right? Something like a untethering of social bonds, backed up by sociological and economic explanation of what that looks like, is a fundamental cause. The disinhibiting and polarizing state of social media is a fundamental cause. Inequality is a fundamental cause. These ideologies of self-realization that clash with solidarity, the emergence of these ideologies, that's a fundamental cause. And it's these sorts of causal explanations that will then show us why it is that we might be struggling with being reasonable enough or imaginative enough. So just saying we've lost our capacity to imagine each other's experience, that's not going to break through to a causal story of what's wrong. And it will be more useful when it comes to fixing our problems, but even there, it's going to be of limited use. I mean, try to get out there and tell people to be more imaginative about others, right? You can do that at an individual level. You can have dinner with your friend and argue that with them. But that is not going to be a way you can achieve transformation. What you need is going to be about some kind of institutional account, some kind of social fabric account, right? You need to make substantive changes to society. This stuff is too deep for extra reasonables and extra imagination, right? The sort of thing I often talk about, because I'm talking to really a set of individuals who are keen on reflecting on their experience, keen on improving their understanding of what it means to be an efficacious citizen. So I often do what you're doing, Anne, right? And I talk about it in terms of these things. But at a big picture level, we're not going to change much by talking about that. Just like the causes are deep-seated, so are some of the limited solutions that are available to us. That's a very, very jumbled and jumpy sort of set of, I hope, constructively critical feedback I've given. If even 20% of this has been useful, then I'd be grateful. So our next question is from RAPHAEL, who is a lurker who's coming out and asking a question. What a pleasure it is to have you on board. Hi Vlad, I'm a UK citizen. I'm writing just as Farage announces his campaign as a candidate for Reform UK in the general elections. This is from a few weeks ago when the UK had the general election. I am pro-EU. I don't like Farage's anti-immigration, his nationalist and borderline racist rhetoric. But I'm now thinking about him in light of your views on assessing politicians at a time of democratic decline and post-truth populism. Is he somebody who's out to break the game of politics? Is he a post-truth populist? Or do you think he poses a danger to British democracy? And if so, how great is this danger? I'd be very grateful to hear your views. Sending much love. Been watching for 2 years. And let's read the niceness from RAPHAEL. I don't tend to read the niceness, but there's so much niceness in these wonderful questions. RAPHAEL says, I think there's something truly beautiful about your spirit, your thinking, and your communication. I find inspiring and enlightening. So let's deal with the first bit first and then come to the much more interesting thing about the power of Farage to speak to Brits. Is he a post-truth politician? Yes, he is. He is not just a political entrepreneur. That's to say somebody who just surfs the moment of moment, historically and politically, for self-advancement without care for whether that breaks political institutions or not. He is more positively out to break political institutions, and therefore he is in the camp that his mate, the one he wants to be mate with, Donald Trump, is. So that's his categorization. It's not as clear as Trump, because Trump is a very classic post-truth populist. Trump's lies are spectacularly internally incoherent. Farage's aren't as much. Farage is 80% into deception, 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 and 20% into saying incompatible things, it's enough for me to categorize him as a post-truth populist and as somebody out to break trust in counter-majoritarian democratic institutions on which democracy depends to deliver anything, whatever your policy positions are. Having said this, we do need to talk about what danger to British democracy Farage poses and what about his message actually might be something that constructive politics can learn from. So let's look at context. They got a small number of seats, but a huge percentage of the vote, the Farage's Reform Party at the last general election in the UK, despite the fact that their campaign was in many ways a clown show. They ran dodgy candidates who they barely knew who they were, who said dodgy things, racist things, misogynist things. They got into all kinds of amateur level trouble. Farage put his foot in it by reciting again his view on Russia-Ukraine, which is a bit Russia sympathetic. And that is out of sync with the British people. Brits are not very exercised about Ukraine, but they feel a preponderant soft sympathy for Ukraine that extends to 70 to 90% of the population. So we're quite clear on our soft sympathy for Ukraine. Yeah, they did so well in terms of the total vote. And moreover, they are in a pattern that is compatible with them becoming one of the major parties at the next general election. So why is this? You know, the Rest is Politics podcast with the lovely Rory Stewart and with Alistair Campbell, they often discuss this there. They're mainly based off YouTube, but they regularly share their videos on YouTube too, so they're kind of colleagues on this platform. And one of the things Alistair likes to say is that he is bewildered by why Farage is everywhere, why he's everywhere on social media, and why he's constantly interviewed by mainstream journalists, including on the BBC. And I mainly disagree with Alistair about this. Where I agree is that it's unacceptable to constantly interview Farage without challenging him. And this is an institutional problem. Journalists don't know how to deal with post-truth politicians or just politicians who lie voluminously. That's to say, a good BBC journalist knows how to deal with somebody who pops a couple of lies per week. They do not know how to deal with somebody who pops 701 lies per week. Because you're interviewing a person, they speak for 90 seconds. That 90 seconds contains 6 untruths. What are you going to do? Well, you've spoken for 90 seconds. Here are the 6 things that are factually wrong about what you've said. Then the interview is over. You don't have time. So what we need is an institutional solution to this, because individual journalists can't deal with this. So they're constantly pretending that politicians like Farage, or indeed like Boris Johnson, are largely not engaged in systematically deceptive discourse. But that's not true. They are. So the only solution here has to be institutional. Because you've got a situation at the moment where journalists, when you have them over for dinner, say, oh my God, this guy's lied 77 times just yesterday, but I interviewed him, I can't, what can I say, what can I do? You need institutional procedures for doing this. Only then journalists can follow. So we need to have editorial policy about what to do with persistent liars and post-truth folks. To that extent, I'm sympathetic with Alistair that this is not on Farage permanently lying and not being challenged on the BBC. Where I disagree with Alistair is that Farage, I think, should be on the BBC because he is on an upward wave. He is clearly hitting some important buttons in the citizenry. And his support is not just significant, it's significantly growing. So the idea that you just exclude him is an idea that is based on the notion that if you close your eyes, your political opponents will go away. So Alistair is a bit naive here, I'm afraid to say. And I say that about somebody who has got extraordinary sort of day-to-day insight about how to do politics much deeper than my own on that day-to-day level. But on this, I'm sorry, Alistair, no. So what is going on? What is it that Farage is doing right, if you like, except just lies and manipulation, if he's managing to speak to British people while being an irresponsible little political brat who does damage and wants to break our democratic institutions? We have a government in power with a huge majority that is not backed by the majority of the population on key issues. The consensus of the majority in Britain and the bracket where you're going to find Labour policy do not overlap very well, which is partly why I wish Labour very well, but I'm worried that they are going to fail as a government and that they're going to enter as a party an existential crisis of the kind the Tories are in a few years from now, leaving both our major political parties in existential crisis potentially. There are key hot points where Brits are out of touch with their mainstream political representatives, or rather the other way around. Probably the single biggest area is neoliberal ideology. Brits don't like it as applied to particular policy issues. Brits do not like the defunding of public institutions that both the major parties stand for. Notice the current government in the UK is, I would say, it's left-leaning on culture and social issues, and subtly right-leaning on the economy. It's, and here I agree with Rory Stewart, having mentioned the Rest of Politics podcast, this is at the moment looking like it is a soft austerity government, which continues the persistence in British politics of the soft Thatcherite agenda that has dominated the major parties for many, many years now. Brits feel resentful about the rapacious privatization of utilities. They feel resentful about the state of collapse and defunding of the public services. So that's one key issue where they're out of touch with the political mainstream, and the political mainstream is out of touch with them. Then there is mass immigration. And I'll talk about this separately because this is a very important issue, that civic support cannot be got virtually anywhere in major Western democracies at the moment for human rights compatible immigration policies. The mass immigration position of Labour and Tories is not compatible with where Brits are at. And I'll talk about how somebody with progressive views might try to negotiate this issue on a separate occasion. This is very important, and part of this will require changing discourse about immigration from rights to something else, like welcoming somebody into your home. So it's a politics of welcoming guests, a politics of generosity, not a politics of rights. Rights discourse has worn out. You can't now argue for immigration with rights discourse, unless you want to just lose politically. Another thing this means, of course, is that you can't bring people into the country and then try to justify it to the population. You have to persuade the population first, then bring people in. So we've got this dynamic where even what we would perceive as a centrist, moderate immigration policy, that in itself is so harsh, often is incompatible with human rights, that is not accepted by populations. So you've got a situation where you're caught in a very difficult position. Either you've got to go right on immigration, or you undermine democratic institutions by encouraging folks to lose trust in them. Difficult. And we'll talk through that more. The very weak climate agenda of the Labour Party is not popular with the population. Brits are, as a whole, a bit allergic to anything that smells of a Green New Deal. Certainly not what's being offered by the Labour Party, but any semblance of that generates resentment. And they are also tired of the consensus in mainstream politics about progressive cultural issues. This is really difficult again, because you've got to make a distinction between what I call unconstructive hyperidentity politics, that damages even the causes it seeks to advance, and genuine elevation of people who are disadvantaged and belong to disadvantaged groups who need to be included and recognized and celebrated, seen and included. This is again very difficult, because the degree of hyperidentity politics we've experienced in the mainstream has created a situation where even non-hyperidentity politics for the advancement of group rights now are struggling to sell themselves effectively. On all of this, Farage is closer to Brits than Labour or the Tories. Where I would start here would probably be with public services. The majority in Britain are out of sync with what the Tories or Labour are doing. They're out of sync with the neoliberal politics that is being offered to them, because they are outraged about the defunding and decrepitude of public services. What is Farage saying? Farage, amid all the lies and all the yucky stuff he comes up with, he says, let's renationalize some of the utilities. He says, let's begin taking care of folks' student debt progressively per each year they work in the National Health Service. Right? Farage is speaking to the British majority. The majority in Parliament are out of sync with the British majority. This is a real problem. What you don't do as a responsible politician, because then you just be an entrepreneur, is say, well, let's count up all the things that the majority think in Britain and then just pander to that. You can't do that. You might end up implementing some very destructive policies. But you've got to reconnect with that majority in a way that the mainstream parties are not doing, thereby leaving the path open to the collapse of democracy in Britain in the 2030s. The collapse of democracy in Britain is a real possibility, right? It's not a 1% chance that it'll happen. It's a more than 10% chance it'll happen in the 2030s. It's not a 50% chance, but it's, 10% is not unrealistic. And it's a matter of degree as well. So this is a worry. So the course we're on at the moment is that unless mainstream politics recaptures some of the political ground from Farage, who holds it destructively and irresponsibly, where we are driving is toward the collapse of the two major parties as an effective force, perhaps the introduction of electoral reform, without solving our problems by then, and then the emergence of authoritarian politicians more scary and more effective than Farage. Because Farage is the kind of guy who could just collapse immediately in power because he's incompetent. He's competent at communication. He's not competent at practical politics. But we could get more competent folks at practical politics who could be better than Farage at holding power, not just at communicating his way toward gaining power. So that's the reality we've got. And therefore, despite his lies, despite him being a highly responsible little brat, he is hitting some pain points that Brits feel that are ignored by our political mainstream. And the longer that persists, the more the political mainstream will collapse and will not be replaced by some lovely constructive politics that then takes care of these issues, takes care to address these issues. It'll be replaced by politics that takes people for a ride on a scale like nothing we've ever experienced before. So that's the power and the danger of Farage. It's something you've got to take very seriously. And we've got to deal with him seriously, not just in the journalistic way I've described, but also by some of the political ground he's trying to occupy being confiscated from him, because in a country that wants to be proud of itself, a little bit of my British patriotism is coming out, we cannot just hand off majority political concerns in Britain to repulsive brats like Nigel. I hope that wasn't too abrupt, and I hope that was a little bit helpful and illuminating. Thank you so much, Raphael. Our next question is from Jerome, and if Jerome's question and my answer to it risk being a bit out of date because they're from before Biden stepped down, the questions from before Biden stepped down, I think we'll take away something epistemically useful from Jerome's question. So let's give it a little whirl, something beyond Biden and the particulars of the politics we're seeing. I'm really frustrated by everything coming about following this debate, including and especially from you. I don't get it. I watched the debate. I expected nothing. I was hoping that he wouldn't fall. He performed exactly as he had done for the previous 3 years. Trump was, meanwhile, lying and displaying his personality challenge. I don't see a difference between this and how Biden has been for the past 3 years. So where is all this coming from? Why did people have different expectations? I feel this is propaganda. I watched the whole debate. At the time to put forth, obviously we have to be generous to Jerome here because he's speaking before Biden stepped down. The time to put forth somebody else was a long time ago, and the information is gone a long time ago, and the information being used to push this narrative now was available then and is in fact thrust in our faces daily. So my sense is that Jerome, my views pretty well. I'll briefly refresh them, but I'll try to take your question in a more helpful and interesting way, because there's this tendency, I think, on YouTube to constantly proceed in terms of points, debate, disagreement. And normally when a question gets asked of somebody who is a public intellectual these days, or somebody who is a content maker on a platform, the answer very often comes back in terms of the specific degree to which they disagree or agree with the points made by the questioner. We always want to grow. We've already in this Q&A done enough telling off when we had the go at the pro-Russian intellectual Mr. Shelin. And by the way, even when we do that, that doesn't exclude the possibility that these people might have interesting things to say. Even Mr. Dugin, who you might argue has blood on his hands through his discourse and through some of his genocidal claims, Dugin still has interesting things to say about our struggles with populism. So that's also an important aside. But let's take this question properly. But before that, probably it is worth saying a couple of things about Biden. So briefly on Biden, before we get to the substance, Jerome, I think that I'm going to guess all of my recent commentary on Biden's cognitive decline. You might not know, although you maybe do, my previous commentary, right? So I made a video 2 years ago about Biden's cognitive decline. In fact, I made a video 4 or 5 years ago about Biden's cognitive decline, which didn't go anywhere because I wasn't broadcasting regularly on YouTube then. So my account hasn't changed except for a sense of the deteriorating decline and how it became already incompatible with a second term years ago for Biden. In other words, I thought this was quite a clear political reality. So I'm not somebody who has woken up to Joe's cognitive decline during the debate. It was just that a lot of people who hadn't been on the ball before woke up to it during the debate. But I don't think it makes sense to just go back and forth, because I think you know my views and they're widely available. So let me try to be useful rather than just sort of, referee degrees of agreement and disagreement. Two points then. One is this: you always grow intellectually and in your political wherewithal. Everybody does. Whether you are the least politically reflective and generally reflective person on earth, you like fishing and all you want to talk about is fishing, or whether you are Ludwig Wittgenstein, the most conceptually imaginative thinker of the 20th century. There's always a lot that you don't get, that unless you're stuck, you're gonna come to see better. It's just there's levels to this. But it's true of everybody, right? If it's not true of somebody, then they're not growing. So therefore, of course, it isn't true of everybody, but it should be true of everybody, no matter where you're at. So always keep the possibility open that there's something that you're not seeing, that other people might be seeing. And it's important to keep that possibility open when people are presenting with something that you find to be obviously wrong or obviously strange. So be open to the possibility you're not seeing some stuff. And it doesn't matter what that stuff might be in this particular case, because we're trying to make a wider point. So that's the first thing. The second thing is understand that everybody else is in the same predicament, right? Understand that you might be unable to see something entirely, but also understand that other people might be unable to see something entirely. So forget about the issue. Imagine that you're right about something and you're saying, oh, I'm being gaslit. There's a lot of truth, practically significant truth about politics that most people are not seeing all the time. So don't be surprised by that. Don't be freaked out by that. Just ask if you're one of these people some of the time, right? So it's very important that we appreciate that a lot of people, most people engaging in political discourse, engage with it with terrific blind spots that they might never transcend, or they might transcend some of the time. So that's a healthy sort of reality dose prophylactic that should lower our degree of shock about people not seeing stuff, right? So you are not seeing a lot beside this issue. There's a lot in politics that is quite clear to see that you're just not seeing because you're normal, right? And then other people are not seeing stuff that you might be seeing, or neither you nor them are seeing it. But that situation of blindness is completely normal. And so if you feel gaslit by that, then you're going to feel gaslit by political discourse, simply speaking, right? So it's this very important understanding that political discourse isn't there to normalize your sense of reality. Political discourse is wonky, it's weird, it's fragile, it's blinded. And that is part of the reality. You don't need to say it's part of the beauty of politics, but it's part of the reality of politics. So that's my big picture answer. I'm not sure if it's given anything, but I've tried. Our next question is from Randy, and Randy says, I value your perspective a lot and feel lucky you have the constitution and life experience to share it publicly. If you're ever doing a Q&A, could you answer this? It occurred to me that your illness might be part of why you're doing this. Feel free to share, but you don't have to. I know it's personal. So no, it's not personal. So I'd love to share a little bit if it's of interest. What I'm doing is really weird and wonky because of my health. The normal course for somebody like me is to stabilize an academic career where I write professional academic stuff and then take steps toward becoming a public intellectual. And I'm doing this the other way around for reasons of, having been sick and had very, very little time over the past 20 years. this means that my ambition is to make both possible. But it also means that at the moment, insofar as I'm experiencing emotional pain about not doing things that I feel are my duty to do, then that emotional pain is really about not making a proper contribution to philosophy, as I'm almost in a physical way urged to do on a daily basis by just being me. There's always the possibility to make something work even when it feels you can't. So this is always a dance about making the impossible possible, and I'm dancing it, and I'm keen on exploring new possibilities. The best possible case scenario is that as I develop my cultural contribution, my contribution as a public intellectual, that in itself will create for me enough space and resource to run parallel to that a more professional, perhaps more narrow conversation with the culture about ethics and politics, more narrow than the public conversation I'm having here. So that's the dream. And the reason that it's happening in the wrong order and that it is so slow is that I'm trying to some extent to make the impossible possible. And I think I shared a few months ago, and I got this lovely email from the editor and literary executive of Isaiah Berlin, who he and I are friendly, who asked me whether in his lifetime, and he's getting on, we will see my Isaiah Berlin book. So that's kind of where we are. I'm dancing a dance, and you can send me love and wish me luck with making things add up that don't easily look like they can, but that I'm trying to make add up. Our next question is from Darren, who says, "Hi Vlad, hi Darren, helpful wishes your way. I'm wondering about something, and here's what it is. I wonder how the development of the exploitation of people as happened in the Middle Ages and in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, how that moved toward a situation in which all people are granted rights and some form of equality. I'm mostly interested in the liberal influences on that, and I mean the classical liberal ideas and where they differ from workers' unions and parties. Do you have any reading suggestions as well?" Well, let's say a couple of bits. The first word you mentioned there that's interesting is exploitation. Now, the most famous account of exploitation in the history of the West is Marx's, although there are accounts of exploitation before Marx. And there are, I think, intimations of conversations about exploitation across the history of the West, and I think you even get that in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But the central story is Marx's, and my own references to exploitation on the channels have typically gone back to the critical theory tradition. Then you talk about the Middle Ages and us transferring into the modern world. I think one of the things that's really important to understand about that is that it forces us into a question of what that was all about, what the emergence of the modern world was all about. Was it progress, or was it just change? In other words, change means stuff happened. Progress means that the transformation constituted a reflective and intellectual improvement on the terms of the humans who preceded the modern world, and not just on terms of us humans in the modern world. Now, the biggest feature of that change ethically is that in the modern world we have the idea that is nearly irresistible, that even if you violate it in practice you have to pay lip service to it, that all human beings are of equal moral worth. That is the single most important ethical conception of all of us here relative to human beings who are not in this slice of the last 3 centuries. Then you mentioned rights. And for rights, you really have to start with Hobbes, even though, again, there are intimations of rights discourse earlier on in the history of the West, including some intimations in Aristotle as well. Although, as opposed to exploitation, which is more palpably present earlier on, it's less obvious that the idea of rights is present earlier on. And the wonderful late classical philosopher Miles Bernier wrote a short and lovely piece once called "Did the Ancient Greeks Have a Concept of Human Rights?" to which his answer was, it may be tempting to think that they partly did, but in the end the answer has to be no. Then you talk about liberal influences and classical liberalism versus workers' unions and parties. Well, classical liberalism continues existing into the 20th century, but neighboring liberal enterprise develops next to it, which you could call egalitarian liberalism or democratic liberalism, that takes much more seriously social harmony, structural issues in society, issues of exclusion, and indeed issues of human flourishing, which generate a conflict between the market and other values, between the free market and other values, the demands of other values on policy, on social arrangements. You already begin to get quite a few departures from classical liberalism in John Stuart Mill's writings. The best living expert on Mill today still is, I think, Alan Ryan, one of my teachers from my postgrad period. Then, into the 20th century, you get Hobhouse in the 1910s. Then you get Rawls's A Theory of Justice that he builds up over quite a few years, that appears in 1971. One thing to keep in mind in all of this, as different kinds of liberal ideas arise, it's very important that they're not created in an ivory tower. It's very important that there's already social momentum that certain conceptions have, and then thinkers take that momentum and clarify it and intensify it and then spit that back out into the culture. So, as Charles Taylor says in his wonderful 1989 book, Sources of the Self, the causal arrow between practice and reflection on practice goes in both directions. And I think here, one of the bigger books to pick up probably is Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, because it talks about how various conceptions across the history of the West arise. A shorter book might be John Gray's little book on liberalism for Open University Press. I think the second edition would be in the mid-90s, and it would just be called Liberalism, author John Gray. And that's from John's days when he was still writing not as a public intellectual, but as an academic. You could also look at criticism of liberalism from a realist tradition, not realism in the international relations sense, but realism as opposed to moralism in political philosophy. You could look at criticisms of liberalism from a realist and left position by looking at some of the writings of Raymond Goyce, who is a retired philosophy professor at Cambridge. I can give you more. Has this been helpful? I hope it has a tiny bit. So our next question is from LUKA, and it's really a comment, not a question. And LUKA is saying, my country, Georgia, is a hotbed for deep Russian anti-Western propaganda at an astonishing scale, trying to U-turn the whole country. I'm an activist working on the problem, solving the population's feelings instead of arguments. Eternally grateful to you for teaching that. So if you think any information in any form, a summary of the main talking points, for instance, would be useful, I'd be happy to share. Of course, do share, LUKA. I mean, this raises a very important question, which is, how do we think about the global tension between democracy and authoritarianism without either underestimating the interconnectedness of authoritarian regimes, but also without overestimating that interconnectedness and descending into kind of idealized kitsch where we conceive of the world as some kind of a large-scale battle between democracy and authoritarian regimes in a way that comes out to be not politically realistic. Georgia is a place we will be talking about and empathizing with more, because you are on course for considerable political turbulence. We've seen some of it, but more is to come, clearly. You've got an authoritarian, illiberal trending government that may need to trend there more to keep power, and you're stuck unsustainably between dependence and independence from Moscow. And I feel that the current situation is both unsustainable, but that it is also true that coming out of it in any kind of democratic and positive way may be really hard short of political change in Moscow. So it's an incredibly difficult situation of instability and vulnerability. So we're sending you love, and of course feel free to share anything. Our next question is from KARAN, who is in Singapore, sending you warmest wishes for your recovery from Singapore. I've only recently come across your channel. Thank you so much for all you do. I have a confession. At 33 years old, my political conscience has only recently awoken. I've recently become a father for the first time. I think that's something to do with it. Huge congratulations. That is so magical and beautiful. As you would be aware, Singapore is not quite a liberal democracy, and freedom of expression and dissent are limited. The social contract here is largely will ensure you prosper. In turn, you won't question us. The culture is focused on material wealth and accumulation, and work hours are often challenging. My question is, do you have any thoughts on how I might foster a deeper engagement with the many issues taking place around the globe while detaching myself from the materialistic bent of the culture around me? How can I go from peripherally following world events to understanding things at a deeper level and caring more? Thank you so much. Terrific question. Let me make an infinitesimal remark on the side first. So I've been sick for 20 years with myalgic encephalomyelitis, and I used to not be able to talk or to walk. Now I'm in a different zone where I have 2 or 3 hours a day on good days to work at home mostly. And I get so many amazing letters and comments from the beautiful community. One of the comments is, get better soon. And I love it. So I'm really not one of those politically correct people who needs the positive health, which is to come in the right package. So I love it. It never even crosses my mind that there's something funny about putting it like that. But let me tell you what is funny about putting it like that, without wanting to stop you if that's how you like to put it. you know, and I know many of you do. So I've got an illness that you can get better from as an outside shot. There is a 5% recovery rate, mostly for people in the first few years of the illness. But the vast population of people with my illness will stay ill until they die, unless, let us say, 1 billion, 1 to 5 billion are put into medical research. Then I think we can fix it within a decade. So that's not magic. I mean, that's not much. It's just a little bit of money in the context of vast sums we spend on other things. But that hasn't happened yet. I'm, you know, pushing for that. Other people are pushing for that. So that's the funny thing, is that I can't realistically get there without that investment. So there we go. You know, when I first got sick with ME, I was a postgrad student at Oxford 20 years ago, and I had a flatmate, and he kept coming in because I just, you know, I'd had a couple of viruses simultaneously, which triggered the ME, and he'd come in and say, "Lad, you're 100% better yet?" And I would say, not yet, not yet. Next day, are you 100%? 20 years on. So there we go. But don't stop saying, get better soon. That's lovely too. Let's deal with you, Karan, because you're asking a very difficult question in a way. Because you're not saying, how do I get better informed? You're asking, how do I deepen my relationship with politics while being in a political culture where I'm a bit alienated, and how do I also care more? Now, there's something magical about motivation. And what's magical about motivation is that you can't think your way through it. What motivates you. So what you do with motivation isn't try to change it by thinking about it. What you do is try to discover more about it. So we'll say more about that in a second. In terms of getting a deeper understanding and feeling more deeply connected, I do think that, you know, part of living life is understanding life, and part of a flourishing life is just understanding better the life you're leading. And you've kind of implied that a bit in your extraordinary experience with having a little one. But that's also true of politics, right? Dealing with politics in a flourishing way is often just understanding politics more. We're often terribly stuck, and YouTube is often terribly stuck in the news cycle. And you know this. 2 things blown up here, 4 things blown up there, good day, brilliant day, bad day, so on. That's how a lot of you are consuming the war, by the way. Now, the risk of that is that it reperpetuates the CNN news cycle from the 90s, which doesn't help you understand enough. And you always have to watch out for this. Like, is my understanding here deepening or not? Now, you might not want to deepen your understanding. You might generally, well, I'm all right for, you know, just to follow stuff and hope the bad guys lose. Fine. But if you want to deepen your understanding, you have to explore things that are a process in time when it comes to engaging with them. So put very banally, when it comes to consuming information, consuming analysis, interpretation, it might mean you focus less on newspaper articles and pay a little bit of attention to longer form, right? That might mean not the New York Times necessarily, but the New York Review of Books or New Yorker magazine. You know, shove that into an app like Speechify, because being a dad is busy, and just play it. You know, play yourself a 40-minute article. Try to pick one that you'll feel you'll be passionate about, you'll be thrilled about, and just play that when you're on a walk. So that way of, you know, altering your diet so that you have sort of more prolonged and more nourishing meals, I think, is very important. You're also asking, of course, about care and motivation, understanding things at a deeper level and caring more. So here I would say that what I just started on is really important. That's to say, not changing your motivation, caring more, but exploring it more deeply, right? Who are you in relation to politics? That's quite curious to explore. That's not a narcissistic thing to explore. You know, what are your concerns? These are things that drive the way you're going to engage with the world. Now, frustratingly, I do think relationships matter here, right? Connecting to people who allow you in dialogue with them over dinner to explore who you are politically. And I know that in certain environments, it may be difficult to find enough people like that, but they're always there. I mean, they're always there. I mean, there are interesting people in Singapore. I don't know Singapore that well, but I visited a lot because of my historical links to Australia. Sometimes for a couple of years I don't go because of my health, but I've gone a lot. So probably I've been to Singapore about 20 times, and maybe 5 to 10 of those I've stayed rather than just coming through the airport. So yeah, put yourself in a position where, I know it's hard as a dad, but put yourself in a position where you're going to encounter people who are going to make you grow politically. And understand that this is an exploration about yourself, right? It's an exploration that's about self-knowledge. Because the question you're asking me, how do I care more, really has two answers. One is you don't. Maybe you just don't care enough. Or you do, and the way you get there is by understanding yourself more politically, exploring your political sensibilities, right? What's your relationship with ideologies? What's your relationship with poverty? What's your relationship with leading a fulfilled life? I mean, in a way, the question that you're asking me is also familiar from a UK experience. I mean, in the UK, we have a factory called an undergraduate degree in PPE, Politics, Philosophy and Economics at Oxford, which is a major factory securing disadvantage in young people. You might say, well, you know, what are you talking about, disadvantage in young people? That's such a privileged thing to do PP at Oxford. And then, you know, end up in law, end up in the city in finance. But the point is that I have seen so many people on that conveyor belt become good, having been good at passing tests at school. There's an epidemic of children at the moment in the West who are not good at much except passing tests as a result of how they're victimized by rich parents they have. So they become good at passing tests. They're not good at thinking about what they need to think about. Passing tests and being able to talk as though you're good at passing tests gets them into elite universities. There they get even better at passing tests and writing quick papers. And then they end up in the city. And they're good at earning money. Therefore, they're good at securing for themselves good accommodation, nice meals, nice tickets to places. But they struggle. They struggle interpersonally. They struggle to be fulfilled in family life. Some of them end up in their 40s separating from their partners, having had children, and feeling existentially lost. So that is the disadvantage of privilege. There's such a thing as a disadvantage of privilege, and some of what you may be talking about certain circles in Singapore could be resonating with that thought. And I certainly see it a lot in the UK. So to snap out of it, you have to understand that human flourishing is a matter of exploration and is a broader thing, and human authenticity is a broader thing, right, than finding stuff that you enjoy and relating to stuff that you enjoy in a kind of consumerist way. Oh, I want this, I'll buy this. There's a lot of things you can't buy. and they're things you have to dance with, dance toward. They're not things that get to you by the press of a button. So I'm saying self-knowledge. I am saying relationships. And I am saying that both of these two are about exploration and not knowing where you're going to land, right? So part of what I understand about what you've written here is that you don't quite know what you want. But my answer is, sometimes it may be true that there's not that much more you want and you feel like you do, but you don't. But very often the answer is, it's actually just about exploring what it is that you want and putting yourself in the right position to have the patience to deal with the uncertainty of where that exploration takes you. I mean, a tiny amount of what I do, now 2 hours a month only, but I've done this historically for quite a while, is personal development coaching, where I don't deal with your personal psychological problems, but I deal with your problems if you are, well, typically for me, historically, it's been dealing with the problems of professional creative artists in middle age. Now, since my more public intellectual role, that tiny consulting window is a bit more open, and some people just want to chat about how they evolve themselves politically. So what I want to say from that experience is, you're not alone. A lot of people feel like this, and it's very important to not get yourself in a kind of dizzying whirlwind where you feel like you want something but you can't quite put a finger on what it is and how to get to it. And that requires having faith that you can move somewhere without having a full sense of what that destination is. And I wish you luck with it. A big part of it is also, in some cases, like that 40-minute article, is sometimes applying willpower to things. Sometimes sort of progressing your wherewithal, your sense of things can require here or there an application of willpower. When a lot of young people, for instance, get into the arts, they have a hunch they're going to love it, but they have to apply willpower for a while to sit through some things. Like, what is this Mozart symphony thing? What is this weirdness? Or what is this thing Rothko has put on this canvas? It just looks like it's a sort of just a wash of color. Stand for 40 minutes. For 10 minutes, stabilize your response. Then see what you feel, see what you think, see what you're reacting to. Then realize that some of your reactions were superficial, they drop off, you continue to look, the canvas begins to speak to you more, and so on. That's true of everything. I mean, it's even true about how we observe politics. So I think that gives you a few clues. They're just very minimal, sort of little brush strokes on the canvas. But I hope I've opened it up for you a tiny, tiny bit. Thank you so much for listening. Our next question is from Dustin, and it's 2 long questions about what you do if you're a progressive and you find that politics is forcing you to choose between the greater and the lesser evil. I'm a US citizen and I'll be asked to vote in November, and I feel the choice I'm facing is voting for the greater evil, voting for the lesser evil, or abstaining. I'm someone who wants to move American politics to the left, but my choices are between a far-right and a center-right party as I see things. A political party is not just entitled to my vote in virtue of being the lesser evil. My despair comes from a perceived lack of mechanisms for change. Bernie Sanders seemed to offer some promise, but then he was squashed by our system. If this is what passes for democracy, I'm inclined to say our democracy has already collapsed. So my next question is, how can progressive-leaning people affect change within the context of a system that is structurally insulated from change? From my perspective, the obvious answer of just get more progressives into positions of power within the Democratic Party is unrealistic. For context, I'm 36. My first moment of political consciousness happened in September 2001. I then experienced my country being dragged into a war under false pretenses. I marched, anti-war marches. I did Occupy Wall Street. I was thrilled to finally see Obama come to power, but was then very disappointed by him. My disillusionment was so great that in 2014, I emigrated to Germany, without friends or family. 10 years later, I'm now a dual citizen. I feel vindicated in my decision to leave. Now I watch the cycle of blackmailing progressives continue. That's to say, the lesser evil choice, blackmailing progressives as Dustin perceives it, into voting for them. So let's try and have a little bit of a go here. I think the first distinction that is really important to make here, Dustin, is between expressive and effective politics. It's a distinction you probably heard me make before. And the point of the distinction is that effective politics is exclusively about what is going to be the outcome of a particular action that I'm going to take. Expressive politics isn't solely focused on that. It's also focused on not associating oneself with things that ethically or politically repel one. So if you give somebody $1,000 and you tell them, can you vote for the most disastrous political candidate, please? I'll pay you $1,000 for it, but I can guarantee you that your vote will make no difference whatever. An effective politics position might say, well, okay, I'll do it, and then donate the money to charities, the political causes I want to succeed, and that thereby my vote for the bad guys will in fact effectively benefit the good guys as I see things. An expressive politics position might say, I'm just not going to have my name on the ballot with a tick for these bad guys. I just can't do it. So that's the beginning of that distinction. I always recommend leaning toward effective politics. But what's very important is that it's impossible to tell someone to sort of simply give up on expressive politics. One thing that's important here is that politics would be impoverished if nobody did expressive politics. And indeed, politics would be impoverished if most people completely gave up on expressive politics. Expressive politics is a very natural human instinct. What becomes a problem, as it has in our culture, is if expressive politics takes such a big slice of the pie that we have people thinking they're pushing for change while all they're doing is theatrics. That's expressive politics going too far. But expressive politics is a healthy part of politics as long as it is in a reasonable balance with effective politics. Moreover, you can't tell everybody to cut it out who is doing expressive politics, because whether you can cut out some kind of extreme expressive politics behavior depends on your character. And you can't argue somebody out of their character, and indeed you shouldn't, because it's authentically about who they are. What is a problem is if false authenticity drives people into expressive politics excessively. But if real authenticity drives you into expressive politics, that's okay, that's unarguable. So imagine somebody who says, yes, I think Trump is a threat to democracy. I believe that Kamala Harris isn't a threat to democracy, but I don't like her politics. So I'm going to abstain even though I'm in a place where my vote would make a difference. What do you say to somebody like that? Well, if they're really serious and they're committed and they're not being BSC and theatrical, then what you say is, look, I can't argue you out of this position, because this isn't about argument. This is about your political character. This is about who you are politically. So let me just speak to who you are, and maybe you then explore whether your understanding of who you are is exactly as you think it is. Because if it's not, maybe you could adjust your position a little bit. So the only engagement that's constructive here isn't, I'm going to argue you out and prove you wrong, because this isn't a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of character. So it'll be about appealing to somebody's character and asking them to reflect on their character a bit more and see if they come to a different view about what their character asks for them in that particular case. And what I want to say is that you can't get that all the way down in every case of strong expressive politics. In other words, there will be a minority of people for whom it's right to increase the chance of Trump coming to office by abstaining, because that is who they are, that is fundamental to their relationship with politics, that they non-align with the lesser evil as they see it. I hope that the number of people for whom that's the right option is a minority. It'd be very disturbing if that were a large number of people, but I can't, propose to us that we seriously seek to persuade everybody in that position out of it. That would be wrong, and it would be incompatible with the diversity of human character and human personality. Now, what I won't argue here, let's move on to another point. What I won't argue here is that there really is a difference between Trump and Kamala Harris, huge difference. For the economy, for climate, for foreign policy, I'm just going to assume that. It's not as vast a difference as you would like to see, and it's still politics that you may reject, but there's a vast difference, and you do recognize that the difference is toward the better side, or toward what you'd call as the lesser evil. What I want to raise now is an interesting point about the idea that it may be okay to actually stand by and let the worse evil of the two evils win. A lot of people think that, so let's explore that for a moment. There are two ways of thinking it. One way says, if we let the worst evil win, then the whole thing will fall apart so badly that it'll need to be rebuilt, and that will lead to a better politics. And here I want to say no chance of that at all, right? If you vote for folks who going to destroy, if you let folks who destroy democracy win, you're just going to destroy democracy. You're not going to have anything arising that's more constructive afterwards. But there is a second, more persuasive argument here that I completely fail to share, but that I have some time for. And that is a kind of a misanthropic position, which says, well, look, if that's how humans want to run their political systems, they deserve things to fall apart. Somebody might take that view, for instance, on a particular issue like the climate crisis. They might say, look, if humans persist with this politics of not doing anywhere near enough on this issue, they deserve the dramatic consequences of the climate crisis to come and bite them on the bum. In the West, that might be democratic collapse. Elsewhere in the world, it might be societal collapse. And I have time for that position, even though I don't share it. I have, in a pluralist spirit, some time for that position, but I don't share it at all. It's completely the opposite of my personality. It's the opposite of who I am. Because if I see a ship with people behaving like a bunch of morons on it sinking, for preventable reasons, my instinct is not, oh, let it sink. My instinct is, for goodness sake, let's save the ship. So even if we're all a bunch of morons, I don't want us to drown. But that's me. And that's what love means, actually, in the context of my frequent mention of that word. So that's another issue. What else do we have here? Well, I think what we have here is a distinction about improvement versus deterioration. We're now in a period where we can make some things better, but our democracies are in decline. So much of what we are in the business of doing now is actually preventing things from getting worse. So how do you react to that as a progressive? Because the real picture you're looking at is How do we stop things from deteriorating over the next 10, 20 years in Western democracies? That's a bigger story for us, preventing deterioration, than the story of, cumulatively making improvements on all the issues that matter. What's your response to that? Do you want to say that because we're in a historical moment like that, that moment isn't for you anymore? You want to check out because the only moment you want to address yourself to is the positive moment where there was perhaps more hope from 1989 till 2014, when it looked like democracy might be on the rise? No answers here, no answers. But a question: how do you relate to being in a historical moment where democracies, including the German democracy, are declining? Perhaps one more point about incrementalism. Incrementalism is crappy, but it matters, right? What the climate policy is of big states may make a small difference to the impact of the climate crisis over the decades to come. But that small difference may be tangible. It may be the difference of somebody's house being flooded or not flooded. It may be the difference between 14 versus 12 climate-triggered wars per year, right, in 2050. That difference between 12 and 14 matters. Little babies live who wouldn't have lived otherwise, right? 12 wars is pretty bad, but it's less bad than 14. So there's always this extraordinarily powerful anti-doomist argument for incremental progress. I know that has a very bad name in politics, but it genuinely makes a difference, right? Improving healthcare a little bit. Make sure that a few thousand people get better treatment for their chronic illness and so on. Perhaps one more comment. One of my anticipations for the decades to come is that the right will move left in the West on economics, and the left and center will move right on culture. That's one of the trends. I'm not saying it's going to be a kind of diametrically opposite situation where people simply swap positions, but there's going to be a trend, and we've already talked about it by discussing the British post-truth populist Nigel Farage, a trend for the right to go left on the economy. There will be some opportunity in that for a constructive, inclusive, progressive populism, but it'll be narrow. But there will be some opportunity. So that's one positive remark I'm going to make. Well, let's make one final point. If Bernie Sanders had become president in 2020, what would your impression of him in power be now? If the public health crisis hadn't happened and hadn't been so badly mishandled, I believe Biden would have lost to Trump. But if the public health crisis hadn't happened and hadn't been mishandled by Trump, I think Bernie could have beaten Trump. It certainly would have been more of a 50-50 race, whereas with Biden it would have been an outside shot to beat Trump without the public health crisis and the mismanagement of it. So imagine that transpired and Bernie wasn't obstructed, and that transpired and Bernie won. It's very important that power may corrupt, but power in democracies, and I know you're questioning whether the United States is a democracy, co-opts. An absolute power might co-opt absolutely. That's an exaggeration. So Bernie would have bitterly disappointed his supporters if he had won, by how little, how handcuffed he would have been and how little he'd been able to do in power, to the point that most of Bernie's supporters would have some kind of feeling about him selling them snake oil before, Because a lot of what Bernie was talking about, there isn't a snowball's chance in hell that he could have done. That doesn't stop the fact that it may have been a good idea to vote for him. And as I say, despite conventional centrist opinion, I think Bernie would have been in a stronger position to beat Trump in 2020 without the public health crisis. So Bernie actually had some electability points going in his favor. And Bernie had some potential to challenge a consensus of technocratic centrism that obtains in so many democracies in the United States too. But it's not even obvious that Bernie would have been a more progressive president than Biden, because Biden is a more efficacious, practical politician when in power and when leadership is required than Bernie. Bernie is a much more compelling campaigner, much more compelling mobilizer of people, much more compelling advocate, and a much more compelling and remarkable politician in his capacity to very quickly encounter a new challenge that people face, a new issue out there in society, and recognize that it's an injustice, recognize that it's a moral crisis, and begin speaking to it. Biden is much more personally empathetic than Bernie. If something is personally wrong in your life, you want Biden to call you, not Bernie. But Bernie is absolutely remarkable at learning and immediately adjusting when he discovers new challenges and then coming to take them on board and fight for them. So he's got all of these remarkable strengths, but it's not implausible to be skeptical about whether Bernie would have actually done more than Biden, you know? So that's some of the complexity you're dealing with. I'm not sure how much this helped, but at least I tried a bit. Wow, that was a long answer and a meandering answer. So I'm extremely grateful if you survived it. Now the question we have next comes from Jason. Jason says, "Good evening. I began following your content sometime after the war in Ukraine began. I'm an American of Ukrainian descent. Much of my family fled the Soviet Union as they repressed Ukrainian language and Ukrainian Catholic Church. I'm struggling with how to understand our American election. I despise Trump, but in some ways Vance scares me more. How should I think about this election? Is it wrong that in some ways I feel I just care about Ukraine more than about America? And I am someone who served in the US Army band. Thank you for everything you do." So, Jason, it's not wrong to be a single issue person in politics. So don't feel I'm going to push you off, that I need to push you off that pedestal. But I'm going to challenge you a bit. What is Ukraine fighting for? Now, I don't think that's the best way to argue for supporting Ukraine, but a couple of the things that Ukraine is fighting for is democracy and independence. These are values. And you want the country you are in to perpetuate these values too. You want the country you are in to be a democracy. It doesn't make any sense for your country to lose its democratic status insofar as it has it, and then to celebrate democracy coming and being sustained elsewhere. Also, when you're supporting Ukraine, what you're really doing is, as an American citizen, trying to back an issue to go through the machinations of your political institutions and then turn out in a way that is favorable to you. So you're engaged in that process. So you're just committed to that process of institutional procedure. You're committed to the life and health of these institutions. They're not very healthy, but they're alive, they're functioning. You're committed to the continuation of that functioning. So anybody who wants to break them, and I've argued that Trump is a semi-existential threat to US democracy, is not your political brother, not your political sister. So I'm saying it's okay to be a single issue person, but don't detach that issue from all the practical dimensions that are necessary for that issue to be advanced and elevated. In other words, you can't just have an instrumental relationship with all of these issues. You have to care for them intrinsically. And then there is something else. Your family's originally come out of the USSR, but you talked about being in the army band, patriotism. Yeah. One of the reasons, think about what Jake Bro is doing on YouTube. A lot of the sort of psychology for what Jake is doing is he's trying to say something important as an American patriot. He's saying, I'm this very nice young man, American citizen, and I'm passionate about what it means for America to do good stuff on the international scene. And as a patriot, I believe that absolutely the right thing for America to do is to back Ukraine. That's Jake's advocacy on YouTube, right? You can't detach your patriotism as a citizen from your support for Ukraine. So in other words, you can't meaningfully support Ukraine without having a tangible image of loving America and wanting America to be something rather than something else. So that's the sort of beginning of an answer to your question. Our next and last question is from Jonathan. It may be the most impossible of all the questions. How can you make someone more likable and how much would it cost? Can you partially build an identity? And can you partially build an identity of self-promotion that furthers your moral goals? Is that moral in the eyes of philosophers? Might that include peddling half-truths in pursuit of the whole truth? So what I'm going to do, Jonathan, is I'm going to try to sneak out, spirit out some questions out of what you've written that may directly speak to what you're worried about, but may not. So you can't make somebody more likable in their personality in any way except one big way, and that is reducing their psychopathology. That's to say, somebody can become more likable once they become less pathological. That could happen to them in terms of work they do on themselves naturally. They could just get over themselves in some ways. Sometimes that will need therapy or some kind of psychoanalytic intervention. But the only way a person becomes nicer is if they're pathological and they become less pathological, right? They have a really bad relationship with their parents from birth. That causes, I'm giving the most caricatural example, causes trauma, and processing that trauma makes them less mean to others. So that's one thing that's clear. Another thing that's important here is that we distinguish between identities we present with and our character. And our culture is rather inclining us at the moment to not distinguish between the two. It is inclining children not to distinguish between the two. And it is infantilizing adults into not distinguishing between the two. Some cultures, like the United States, are more susceptible to this than other cultures. But the point is, that kind of external presentation is what Hans-Georg Muller on a neighboring YouTube channel would call a profile, and not an authentic representation of character. Now Hans-Georg Muller might be skeptical of my view that there is such a thing, that we can still have, that is somebody's authentic character detached from their profile. But that's a conversation I'm going to leave for another day. So don't confuse, right, some kind of external theater that you live out full time with who you are behind that, right? We can make that distinction. I mean, for instance, a lot of people who are very public advocates for good causes on social media are transparently unlovely narcissists, right? So we can look behind their fluffy costume that they put on and see that they're, yuckies. Something else that's worth saying is that we live in a world where human beings' ethical identities are compartmentalized. That's to say that we inside of us, and it's not good, but we inside of us lack integrity, not in the sense of being decent, but in the sense of being whole. So you often have a situation where somebody, as CEO of a company, might favor that company taking actions that are very bad for the local environment. At the same time, as a parent in their private role, that very same person may favor taking actions that are good for the environment in the local area. And the question is, excuse me, do these two halves of you speak to each other, or they just operate in separate bubbles? And the answer for a lot of 21st century humans is that they live in an inner reality of ethical compartmentalization, and ethical bits of people no longer speak to each other. This works also in another way. You might have people who have a completely utilitarian ethical response at work, but a completely non-consequentialist ethical response at home. At home, they think about the intentions behind an act centrally. At work, they think about consequences. Excuse me, do these utilitarian and pseudo-Kantian bits of you speak to each other, or are they just separate, in separate bubbles? No, they're in separate bubbles. And people can have 6, 7, 8 sort of zones of ethical compartmentalization that don't speak to each other. And that is not just an individual failure, I would say, because it's something our culture encourages. Our culture makes that very natural, but it is nevertheless not a good psychic way in which to find yourself. I don't know what kind of award you deserve if you survived this long-form question and answer session. See you very soon for much shorter conversations. Big love.